Okay. So, all right. So when we left off last time, we're talking about capillaries. And one of our big chunky topics when we think about capillaries is this idea of net filtration pressure, which as you move forward in future courses, I suspect will come back because these filtration pressures can play a big role in disease. Disease can alter these different Starling's forces. So last time we calculated out together what that net filtration pressure looks like at the arterial end of a capillary. And we skipped over doing the exact calculation for what's going on at the venule end, though we did go over what the answer is. But we're going to walk through that now to jog our memories on that before we go into our understanding of veins. Okay. So what you have been looking at here, you're solving for net filtration pressure at the venule end of a capillary. You're thinking about how it compares to the arteriolar end. Okay. So what we're trying to remember and figure out whether there's net filtration or whether there's net absorption. And we want to pick out which of these Starling's forces change relative to the arteriolar end. We'll walk through that. If you keep going on your own, if you're not quite done, that's okay. Okay. So what we're starting out with is we need to figure out what our forces for filtration are and what our forces for absorption are. Because to find out our net filtration pressure overall, right, what we're doing is we're adding up any tendencies towards filtration, any forces that favor filtration. Okay. And we're subtracting away any forces that favor absorption. So that's our first step, is figuring out which ones those are, or remembering which ones those are. Okay. You can easily remember that this is how we have to set this up because we are calculating a filtration pressure and there's the F right in there. Okay. So a reminder of our directions when we're looking for forces for filtration. Filtration, we're talking about filtering stuff out of the blood. So filtration is our out direction, absorption is our in direction. Okay. So to do this, we need to add together anything that goes in that filtration direction. So we can easily see these here on this map. Okay. So we're adding together the hydrostatic pressure of the capillary. So that force of blood pushing out against capillary walls. Plus any pull, we're thinking of this pi as a pull. So that's our osmotic pressure of any solutes, impermeable solutes that are here in our interstitial space. So that's our osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid. And we're subtracting away, again, a push and a pull. But we're flipping what we're thinking about, right? So the push that goes for absorption is the push of any fluid here in the interstitial space. So that's our hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid. We also have a force for absorption coming from proteins dissolved in the blood in the capillary. They stay there, so they exert an osmotic oncotic pull. They have an osmotic oncotic pressure inside the capillary, so they're pulling water towards themselves. So from here, we can just fill this out, right? Okay. So our pressure in the capillary, the hydrostatic pressure, is at 16. Our osmotic pressure of the interstitial fluid is 0. Okay. So we have a total of 16 for our forces for filtration. Then we're going to subtract away our hydrostatic pressure of the interstitial fluid. So 1 plus our, what did I lose? Okay, here, our osmotic pressure of the capillary, which is 25. So that's those proteins pulling water towards themselves. So overall, for our total NFP at our venule end, I get 16 minus 26, which is how we get to our -10 value that you saw in your slides as the pressure, the net filtration pressure at that venule end. Okay. So since we have a negative number here for our net filtration pressure, this means that overall we have more of a force for absorption. And we can see that in our calculation, right? So you can see that overall our forces for absorption added up to 26 here, right? More than our forces for filtration. So what happened here is as we go from the arterial end to the venule end, we see a drop in that hydrostatic pressure of the capillary. So this is the number that's different from our calculation on Monday, because we are actively moving fluid into that interstitial space as we run down the length of the capillary. That hydrostatic pressure is dropping, shifting our balance. So this is why we see overall filtration happens across the capillary, but that filtration is happening more in the first part. We have a bunch of fluid filtering out near the arteriolar end of the capillary. Then we have a little bit coming back at the venule end. Questions about NFP now that you've had a little time to mull it over? Okay, cool. So if we think about this in a stepwise manner, hopefully it's not too bad. Thinking about it all at once. Sometimes for some people can get a little scary, but step by step, you can get there. Okay, so our final bit, we had mentioned that injuries can change these Starling forces. So we have various diseases that can change those different pressures, either the pushes, the hydrostatic pressures, or our pulls, our osmotic or oncotic pressures. And if we shift those different pressures, we may end up shifting how much fluid we're filtering into tissue. If you filter more fluid into tissue, you get swelling, or we might absorb more into the blood, kind of causing changes potentially to blood volume, affecting things like blood pressure. Although in disease states, things get kind of complex because often multiple different organ systems are being affected at once. But we looked at how in injuries, when capillaries get damaged, they're leaking fluid and especially leaking proteins. And we have this signaling molecule histamine that's increasing how permeable our capillary is to proteins. That's shifting our osmotic pressures. So we're shifting the kind of pull as we have more proteins in that interstitial space. They're pulling more water to the tissue, causing some swelling there. And we have a couple other diseases we can mention here that might affect some of these Starling's forces. So when we see liver disease, one of the things that can happen here is that we can decrease plasma proteins. So I'm gonna have a question for you. So if we decreased our plasma proteins, said this, so which force might we be affecting here? And then what overall effect are we going to see on the NFP? Are we going to make a larger number? Are we going to have a bigger force for filtration? Are we going to have a lower number, potentially going towards the negative, taking us towards more absorption than normal? So without any numbers here, I want you to take a try. Start with which force you're changing, and we can think about up or down. I'm sorry, I couldn't make it do subscript, so I put that in parentheses next to our symbols. So let's take a look and I'll draw it out. Okay, nice. So we're kind of together here. Okay. So walking through this, okay, if we're thinking about our arterial here, venule here, this is our capillary, our interstitial fluid up here, we're going to have on the top. Right? What we're thinking about when we're thinking about a decrease in plasma proteins, right? Like usually those plasma proteins are here, right? And they're usually pulling on fluid, right? So the osmotic pressure of the capillary itself is one of our forces for absorption and moving in. However, overall, if we think about the effect that this is going to have, right? If you have fewer proteins here in the blood, so fewer proteins pulling some of that fluid back into the blood, we're going to see that overall, that's going to tip the balance towards a bit more filtration. We're subtracting less away, So this is a reason we might see kind of some swelling if in these disease states. Well, often when we think about shifts to Starling's forces and filtration and absorption across the capillary, a lot of the effects that we're going to see is basically swelling. But we can also see changes to things like blood pressure. So kidney disease affects how you are processing the blood, how you're filtering it out and determining how much to urinate. It tends to increase blood volume when you have kidney disease, therefore overall increasing blood pressure. So this might increase the hydrostatic pressure in the capillary, like we looked at in the liver disease just now. This does also have a tendency to decrease plasma proteins, so changing those forces for absorption as well. So you got kind of a double whammy here, affecting two of our Starling's forces. Heart disease is linked to a lot of effects on the heart, but it does also cause pulmonary edema. So edema is a word for swelling. So we again can affect some of these pushes and pulls when we have pulmonary edema and are affecting the heart. Those are just tidbits about where you might see this coming back again in your future lives. Okay. So we're going to move on to our next set of vessels. So reminder, our order of vessels, right? We've covered our heart, then we went to our arteries. Okay. And when we were thinking about arteries, a big thing that we're thinking about with arteries is that they have low compliance, but high pressure. So they're really a driving force for pressure throughout the systemic circuit. So we thought a lot about pressure here. And our delta P, with that flow equation. And then we move to our arterioles. And a big topic with our arterioles was resistance, right? We talked a lot about smooth muscle, how it changes, and how that can affect our total resistance in a system. Okay. Reminder why we were thinking about that, right, is when we're thinking about flow, we need a pressure difference, and we need to think about how much resistance or how much TPR, total peripheral resistance, we have in the system. So now we've been talking about capillaries. And our big topic with the capillaries is really this concept of net filtration pressure and exchange. NFP is our big topic for capillaries. Not our only topic for any of these, of course. These are big things to focus on. Now we're going to be thinking about venules and veins. So we're again going to be thinking sort of about pressure, but the reason we're going to be thinking about pressure, so we're going to be thinking again about this idea of compliance. We're going to be thinking about how veins hold volume and how this affects overall, eventually our blood pressure and what's going on with pumping blood through our heart. Okay. So we have next will be venules, leading us to veins. And really overall, what we're going to be trying to understand is return to the heart. Okay. Reminder, arteries move us away from the heart. That's why it's an A. Veins move us back towards the heart, ultimately leading us into the right atrium first as we cycle through the right side of the heart in our pulmonary circuit, and then to our left atrium, where we go to our left ventricle and pump blood all the way through the body through the systemic circuit, defined by their direction, but it tends to be true that we have oxygenated blood in our arteries and we have deoxygenated blood in our veins. It just flips when we think about right side of the heart stuff and the pulmonary circuit. But for our systemic circuit, that always works. Okay. So now we're going to be thinking about what's going on in these veins. And one of the things we're going to notice about the veins upcoming is that our peripheral veins are going to have a new structure in them, new for our vasculature anyway. We're going to have valves here. Okay. So if we're thinking about the vessels that are leading us into those larger veins, just like we had arterioles on one side of the capillary, we have venules on the opposite side of the capillary. They're smaller than an arteriole. They're connecting us to the veins from the capillaries, and they don't really have much smooth muscle here in our little teeny itty bitty venules. Some exchange is still happening across the wall of that venule. So some of that venule is working a little bit like our capillary was just now with this net filtration pressure stuff. A little bit of exchange still happening as we're flowing back towards the vein. Okay. When we look at the veins, we can see that there is smooth muscle here, right? These are larger. Specifically, they're larger in diameter than our venules were. They have thin walls, though. They've got some smooth muscle in here, but relative to an artery, especially, that's going to be a really thin wall. You've seen how arteries bounce back in lab if you pinch them. Veins partially look dark because you can kind of see the blood in them because that wall is pretty thin, pretty floppy. A structure that our veins, or at least our peripheral veins, so out in the periphery, so that the periphery is most of your body, honestly. We're excluding like the thoracic cavity, the stuff right next to your heart here. Okay, but most of the body, we're going to have valves. And the valves in the veins are going to allow us to keep blood moving just in one direction. So just like we had valves in the heart and in our great vessels coming out of the heart, making sure that all our blood is going through the heart in the appropriate direction, we have the same thing in veins here. Okay, so they're present in the peripheral veins. If you were looking at the big veins right in your chest, your central veins, you wouldn't see them there. Okay. One of the big purposes of veins is to hold most of your blood. So we think about them as a volume reservoir. They help you maintain blood volume. We'll see on a pie chart, I think the next slide, they're holding most of the blood in your body, the majority of it. One of the reasons they can do this is they're highly compliant. So we mentioned that we have low compliance when we're looking at an artery because we want them to act as a pressure reservoir, right? And we want them to have a lot of pressure because it's a pressure difference that allows us to move blood through the systemic circuit. We don't want that happening in a vein because it's the opposite side, right? To have a pressure difference, you need a high pressure, but you also need a low pressure. So we want our veins to not be under particularly high pressure, but we do want them to be able to hold a lot of blood. So this is why it's good that they are highly compliant here. So in our veins, thinking about this idea of compliance, before we look at that compliance graph that we've drawn at least once before briefly, I want you to just imagine you're adding like a liter of fluid to your body, right? You're getting fluids intravenously or something. So I want you to think about what this increase in volume is going to mean for the, the pressure, I missed a word here, the pressure in an artery or the pressure in a vein. Okay, kind of even split. But the answer is that as we put volume, any given volume, into these two types of blood vessels, you increase the pressure of an artery a lot, That's what's going on with this low compliance. Versus in a vein, you can put a lot of volume in there and you don't see much of a pressure change. So we'll look at a figure of this. So here's our compliance again. Okay. So compliance is just a relationship between pressure. So distending pressure is like how much pressure is across the wall here. And the volume. So the volume of blood inside that vessel. Okay. So if we read it, what we're looking at for any given volume, right? So here's a volume, so some normal amount of blood, right? I'm not going to put a number on it, right? A vein with, maybe we'll put a number on it, say 5 liters of blood, right? So if we have 5 liters of blood here, you can see that we have relatively low pressure for that vein, for that amount. But for that same volume, for our arteries with their low compliance, that same 5 liters is going to correspond to a lot more pressure, right? And this is good because the arteries are on that high end of our pressure gradient, right? We want them to have high pressure so that we push blood through the cardiovascular system. We want the veins to have lower pressure because we need the opposite side of that pressure gradient to have lower pressure so that we can have return to the opposite end of our vasculature. Okay. This exists for any volume, right? So if we have a different volume, so now we're at 7 liters, we can't even see where this would cross the artery line, right? We'd have to go way, way, way out to the right. This is useful for thinking about it in the opposite direction, right? So for any given pressure, right? If we pick a pressure, right? That pressure in an artery, to create that amount of pressure, you only need to put a little bit of blood in to make that pressure. But to get that pressure in a vein, you'd need to put a lot more volume here. So we can read this compliance graph either way. We can think about, okay, at that volume, what would the pressure be? Or we can think about at that pressure, what would the volume be? We're just talking about a relationship, right? And so when we say low compliance, right, we're talking about this lower line. When we say high compliance, we're talking about this high line. Our veins are highly compliant, making them a good reservoir for volume, right? So they can hold lots of volume without needing a big increase in pressure. Okay. So overall, if we're tracking where your blood is hanging out, most of it at any given moment is hanging out in the systemic veins and in the venules on the order of 60%. Relatively little of it is in the heart, the capillaries, or your arteries and arterioles, right? Relatively little of it is in the arteries and arterioles, but they're under high pressure, even with that little amount, because of their low compliance. Even though we have all this blood in the venules and veins, because they're highly compliant, this isn't creating a ton of pressure in our veins. So one of the things we're interested in veins is their effect on blood volume. Another thing that we need to understand when we're thinking about veins is how are we getting that blood back to the heart, right? That's their job, is to carry blood back to the heart. Now, if you think about the blood that's in your foot, right? To get back to your heart's up here, right? So that blood is going to need to move against gravity to return to your heart. And it's not necessarily so easy, right? This is part of why if you have low blood pressure, sometimes you might feel a little dizzy. You might have your vision go a little gray when you stand up, that rush of gravity pulling blood down. But we don't want our blood to pool in feet that get more and more and more swollen, lower how much blood we're pumping out through the arteries. So your body has ways to help those veins fight against gravity, even though they're at this point under pretty low pressure. So they don't have a great big pressure gradient as we're thinking about going back to the heart. Okay. So we're going to be thinking about basically two pumps when we think about how we are able to make this blood move against gravity, even though it's under low pressure, back towards your heart. So the first pump is our skeletal muscle. So our skeletal muscle pump. Basically, this means when you move, it helps your veins return blood to the heart, right? That's the gist of this. So like when they tell people to walk around on a plane to reduce swelling or something, right? This is part of why, like physically moving your body using your skeletal muscle helps you return blood, return fluid to the heart. And this is because of those veins, those valves in the veins. So when we're thinking about the veins, right, we got a vein and an artery usually lying next to each other, but we're just going to think about the vein for right now. We're going to be thinking about also skeletal muscle around it. Okay. So I got skeletal muscle here. Okay. So the valves are going to be in the veins, creating like little segments, right? Segments of vein, kind of. Okay. So when you move, you contract your muscle. That's what skeletal muscle is for, pulling on bones, pulling by contracting. And when muscles contract, they kind of ball up, right? So we move from a kind of relaxed state. So maybe I'll draw on the other side, kind of like this. Okay. So as the muscle contracts and changes shape, right, it's going to kind of bulge. All right, so here's our contracted muscle. I'll put another contracted muscle over here. And we've still got that vein running through it. So we've still got a vein in the middle. So, but now we can see we're really squeezing that vein in the center. Okay. So we've squeezed it. We've narrowed this space that it has to run through. We're pushing it from the outer walls in, which means we're increasing pressure right at that point, right where that vein is running through the muscle. So everything works on pressure gradients, right? So what we've done here is we've created a relatively high pressure here in the middle where we're being squeezed, okay, relative to lower pressure over here and lower pressure down here, where we have those more relaxed parts or narrowing points in the muscle. Okay. So we always have movement from high pressure to low pressure. So if we're thinking just about forces, right, this means that we're squeezing blood this way, high to low. We would also be squeezing blood this way, high to low. However, we've got a valve, right? So the pressure to move back down is there, but we got a door blocking that flow back down. Our valve up top, those valves have a direction that they open. So as we have that high pressure there, it pushes this valve open, allowing the blood to move up to that lower pressure section. That's basically how this works. When the skeletal muscle relaxes, right, we've probably emptied out this section with high pressure a little bit. We'll have some blood flow back into segments between muscle before we do this again. So this is overall how we can kind of move blood back towards the heart using our skeletal muscle in combination with these valves in the veins. Right? We're just creating brief moments of high pressure, piece by piece. So it can be helpful to kind of sequentially contract your muscle in a specific order if you're trying to force it back to the heart. So the other type of pump we have depends, well, it does depend on behavior of the thorax, which we haven't really talked about yet because we're going to talk about breathing next unit. So I'm going to give you a little primer first before we think about that. Okay. So what happens when you're breathing? All right, you've got your rib cage. All right. I'm not going to draw a normal number of ribs. We've got our ribs. And we have a muscle called the diaphragm. It's attached to your ribs. And it has a relaxed state where it's up. And when you tighten that muscle, right, tightened muscles become shorter. So when you tighten this muscle, just tighten the diaphragm, it's going to flatten out. Yep. So we're going to flatten the diaphragm. And it's going to be in a contracted state. Okay. So this is part of how you breathe. Okay. So right when you start to breathe, you are going to move the diaphragm down. So in order to breathe in, when people say breathe with your diaphragm, you're contracting this muscle, pulling it down, moving it from this domed state down to this flattened state. Okay. So I want you to think about the thorax. And so the thorax is going to be here. And your abdomen is below your rib cage, right? So your abdomen is down here. Okay. So when we inhale and we go from picture 1 to picture 2, at that initial point when we first contract the diaphragm, do you think that we increased or decreased the pressure in the thorax here in this top half? Okay. That's the picture. Think for a second, and then I'm going to poll you. Let's take a look. Okay. So actually, at that first moment, as you start to contract the diaphragm, right, that at that initiation of breathing, as you start to inhale, why don't you think about the relationship between like volume and pressure as like feeling claustrophobic, right? So initially, when we're starting out, right before we begin to breathe, our diaphragm is in this relaxed state. But if we just draw a circle around the amount of space we have here, right? Your lungs, your heart, your central veins, they're trapped in a kind of small space here, right? So they're relatively under kind of high pressure before you start to inhale. right? So right as you begin to inhale, and your diaphragm moves down, we're giving ourselves more room, right? So we've made a bigger space. We're not feeling so claustrophobic anymore. We're creating kind of a vacuum. We're creating kind of suction, actually, by making a lower pressure in the thorax. So we'll talk about how that affects air in our next unit, how that pulls air in. But this also affects the veins, because there are veins going back to the heart here in the thorax. Like they go back to the heart on the approximately kind of middle left side of your body. So they're running through here. Okay. So we want to think about when we breathe in, the way we breathe in is we create low pressure here in your chest. Okay. You can remember just that fact on its own, or you can spend some time breathing and thinking about pressures. I'll kind of segue you into our Unit 2 stuff later on. But I wanted to introduce that, or at least show you what's going on here, because when we think about our respiratory pump and the veins, it's working because of that change in pressure in the thorax when you breathe. Okay. So when you start to inspire, inspiration, when you start to inhale, that dropping of the diaphragm and expansion of the chest cavity is giving us more room to play here in the thorax, decreasing our pressure in the thoracic cavity, okay? Which means this is another way that we're creating a kind of pressure gradient, right? If you have low pressure in the thoracic cavity versus a higher pressure in the abdomen, right? If we're thinking thorax to abdomen, then I'm just going to draw some circles, right? So thorax up here, abdomen down below. If you create a pressure gradient, right? Low pressure here in the thorax, it's going to trade off with pressure in the abdomen because they're touching each other, right? So if you made more space in the thorax, creating that low pressure, that means you kind of compressed everything in your abdomen. You're squishing the stuff in your abdomen in order to give your thorax, give your lungs, give your heart more room. All right, so now we have a pressure gradient that we've just created with our breath by moving the muscles in our chest. So now we have a high to low gradient, which means that we can return blood from the abdomen to the thorax. So that's part of our respiratory pump. Both the skeletal and the respiratory pump are ways to temporarily create a little pressure gradient for ourselves so we can go high to low pressure, so that we can fight gravity and come back towards the heart, even though usually we should expect the veins to be under relatively low pressure compared to the rest of our blood vessels. Okay. So we've created the pressure gradient, returning our blood to the thorax. These pressures do reverse when you exhale, right? So this is specifically for inspiration, inhaling. Okay. When you want to inhale, you do this. But when you exhale, your thorax and your abdomen are going to trade, basically, right? So when you exhale, that's actually when the diaphragm bounces back up to its relaxed state, creating a dome. Now your thorax is feeling claustrophobic. It's under higher pressure because it has less space, and your abdomen is trading off. Then your abdomen is under lower pressure. Okay. When you exhale, higher pressure, abdomen under lower pressure. And that's a little helpful because you do also need to push that blood into the heart when it fills, right? So you do need a little bit of a gradient between the veins right next to your heart, the vena cava and the right atrium, in order for blood to passively flow from the veins, those central veins, into the heart as it fills during diastole. So it's helpful that we have this kind of shift back and forth in how much pressure is in the thorax. So big picture here, that when we change pressure on veins, we're able to create pressure gradients that allows us to move blood. For the respiratory pump specifically, we're thinking about the movement of blood into the thoracic cavity, so that final compartment where we also find the heart. Once we move blood there, and when we move from inhaling to exhaling, we're going to increase the pressure in those central veins right next to the heart. And this is going to allow us to increase the amount of blood moving into the heart itself. So the central veins are the ones right here in the center. That's our central venous pressure would be there. Venous return, we're talking about returning to the heart, increasing venous return, more blood coming back from the veins flowing into the heart. Okay. So 2 ways that we are affecting this venous return, right? So we are using the skeletal muscle pump to get out from the periphery up towards our abdomen. Then we're using our respiratory pump to move blood from the abdomen into the thorax. And then as we go through our breath cycle, we are able to move that blood back into the heart itself. Okay. So there are factors that influence venous pressure and influence venous return, which we care about because we also care about heart function. So one of those things is blood volume, right? So we do have a relationship always when we're thinking about blood vessels between volume and pressure. That's what compliance is about. So even though our veins are highly compliant, right, it is still the case that when the volume of blood in the veins goes up, we do see an increase in the pressure in the veins, not as much as it would be if we were looking at an artery, but still going that same direction. If you don't have as much blood, if you have decreased blood volume, you're going to have decreases in the venous pressure as well. Okay. So long term, when we regulate blood pressure, we're going to be thinking about that blood volume. So this stuff will come back a little bit when we talk about kidneys in our renal unit. When we think about MAP, probably on Friday, we're going to be thinking about some nervous system effects that help us regulate blood pressure as well. So we'll stop here. We'll think about tone and go through one of the flow charts from your book at the beginning of Friday. Say about 2 words on the lymphatic system, and then go into that MAP stuff.